When a group of German prisoners of war were told they would be leaving their camp for a short work assignment in a nearby Missouri town, most of them expected another routine task involving unloading supplies or repairing equipment. Yet when the truck stopped in front of a small candy store on the town's main street, and the guards ordered them inside to help carry delivery boxes, the soldiers suddenly found themselves standing among shelves filled with jars of colorful sweets, chocolate bars, and boxes of candy stacked across the store. A sight so unexpected for men who had spent years watching food shortages spread across wartime Europe that several of them quietly wondered if the display had been arranged intentionally to convince them that American stores were far richer than reality. The morning began like many others inside the prisoner of war camp, with the guards moving through the barracks shortly after sunrise while the prisoners gathered outside for the daily roll call, a routine that had become so familiar that most of the men could almost predict every step of the process before it happened. Names were read, groups were assigned to various maintenance duties inside the camp, and the soldiers slowly returned toward their barracks to prepare for another ordinary day of waiting and small tasks behind the wire fences. Yet on that particular morning, a small number of names were called again after the usual assignments had already been given, and the prisoners who heard their names were instructed to report to the front gate, where a transport truck had been parked along the dirt road outside the camp. Any change to the regular routine immediately drew attention among the men, because life inside the camp rarely offered surprises, and the soldiers selected for the outside work detail gathered their caps and jackets while exchanging quiet looks of curiosity. Outside the gate, the truck engine was already running, while two American guards stood beside it holding a list of names. Through the interpreter, the prisoners were told that they would be traveling into a nearby town to assist with unloading several deliveries that had arrived earlier that morning. The explanation sounded simple enough, and although the men did not know exactly where they were going, the chance to leave the camp for a few hours was enough to spark a small sense of curiosity among them. The prisoners climbed into the back of the truck and sat along the wooden sides as the vehicle slowly began moving away from the camp road. Within minutes, the familiar sight of the guard towers and fences disappeared behind them, replaced by the wide farmland that surrounded much of rural Missouri. The road stretched through open fields where barns and farmhouses appeared in the distance, and the men watched quietly as the landscape passed by. Many of the soldiers had spent months inside the camp with only limited views of the surrounding countryside, so even the simple experience of traveling along a rural road felt unusual after the long routine of captivity. The truck passed rows of cornfields and small wooden houses while occasional automobiles moved along the highway in the opposite direction, reminders that civilian life continued normally beyond the boundaries of the camp. After some time, the farmland began to give way to the edges of a small town. Brick buildings appeared along the road, followed by a row of storefronts facing the main street, where a few pedestrians walked along the sidewalks carrying bags or stopping to speak with one another. The truck slowed as it entered the town center, passing a barber shop, a grocery store, and a hardware shop before finally stopping in front of a narrow building with large front windows. Through the glass, the prisoners could already see shelves and counters arranged inside the store, and several glass jars filled with bright candy pieces were visible near the front display. A painted sign above the entrance identified the building as a small candy store that served the local community. The guards climbed down from the truck and signaled for the prisoners to follow them onto the sidewalk. The interpreter explained that several delivery boxes had arrived earlier that morning and needed to be carried into the storage room behind the shop before the owner could begin arranging the merchandise for customers. As the door opened and the prisoners stepped inside the store, the smell of sugar and chocolate filled the air, and the men immediately noticed the rows of jars and boxes covering the shelves. Glass containers held colorful sweets of different shapes, while counters displayed wrapped chocolate bars and small packaged candies stacked neatly in rows. For a moment, the prisoners slowed their steps while looking around the store, because the sight of so many sweets gathered in one place felt strangely unfamiliar after the years of rationing and shortages that had shaped life in wartime Europe. Candy had long ago become a rare luxury back home, and seeing entire shelves filled with it created a quiet sense of disbelief among the soldiers. Several of them glanced at one another while the guards pointed toward the delivery crates near the entrance, silently wondering the same thing. Could a small town store really be filled with this much candy during a war? Many people who enjoy these stories watch on television. Subscribing helps make sure the next story appears automatically. The interpreter soon reminded the group that they had not been brought into the candy store simply to look around, and the prisoners turned their attention toward the wooden delivery crates stacked near the entrance while the store owner began explaining where the boxes needed to be carried. The task was simple. The crates had to be moved into a storage room at the back of the shop where the goods would later be unpacked and placed on the shelves for sale. The men lifted the first crate carefully and began walking through the narrow aisle that ran between the counters and the wall of shelves, moving slowly so that they would not bump into the displays of glass jars that stood filled with brightly colored sweets. As they passed along the aisle, several of the prisoners could not help glancing toward the rows of candy surrounding them. Large jars filled with striped peppermint sticks stood beside containers of wrapped caramels, while nearby shelves carried boxes of chocolate bars stacked neatly one above the other. Some of the candies were wrapped in bright paper that reflected the light from the front windows, creating a display that looked more like something arranged for a holiday celebration than a shop operating during a global war. For men who had spent years living with strict food rationing in Germany, the sight felt almost unreal. Sugar had become increasingly scarce back home long before many of them had been captured, and sweets had gradually disappeared from everyday life as supplies were redirected toward the war effort. Yet here, inside this small Missouri shop, the shelves seemed filled with them. The prisoners carried the first crate into the storage room behind the main shop area and set it down beside several other boxes that had already been stacked along the wall. The room was smaller and dimmer than the store itself, with wooden shelves running along one side and a work table placed near the center where the store owner would later sort the deliveries. Once the first crate had been placed on the floor, the men returned toward the front of the store to collect the next box. Each trip through the aisle gave them another chance to observe the displays more closely. One shelf held rows of small paper bags filled with colorful candy drops, while another section displayed wrapped chocolate bars arranged in perfect lines. There were also glass jars filled with licorice sticks, gumdrops, and round sweets coated in sugar that sparkled under the light. As they carried the second crate toward the back room, one of the prisoners slowed for a moment while looking at the shelves, clearly surprised by the variety of sweets that seemed to fill every available space. The longer they worked inside the store, the more the same quiet thought began forming among them. It did not seem possible that such a small-town shop could have this much candy available during wartime. By the time the third crate had been carried into the storage room, several of the prisoners had begun exchanging short glances with one another while they walked through the aisles. None of them spoke openly about what they were thinking, but the questions seemed to be shared among them all. Perhaps the store had been arranged this way on purpose. Perhaps the shelves had been filled especially for their visit. The idea did not sound impossible to men who had spent years surrounded by wartime propaganda on both sides of the conflict. Governments often tried to show strength through carefully staged displays, and the soldiers wondered quietly if what they were seeing inside the candy shop might be another example of the same kind of message. While they continued carrying the remaining crates toward the storage room, the store owner moved calmly behind the counter, speaking occasionally with the guards while customers from the town entered the shop and walked through the aisles as if nothing unusual were happening. The calm routine of everyday shopping only made the scene feel even stranger. Because if the shelves had truly been arranged as a display for the prisoners, the local customers certainly did not seem to know anything about it. and that made the question in the soldiers' minds even harder to answer. After the last of the delivery crates had been carried into the storage room, the store owner opened one of the boxes and began removing several smaller packages wrapped in brown paper, placing them carefully onto the wooden table in the center of the room, while explaining through the interpreter that the prisoners would now help organize the sweets before they were brought out to the shelves. The men gathered around the table and watched as the owner cut the string around the first package and folded the paper back, revealing rows of chocolate bars packed tightly together inside the box. Each bar was wrapped in printed paper and stacked neatly in bundles that had been protected during transport so that they would arrive in perfect condition. One by one, the prisoners began lifting the bars from the crate and carrying them toward the main shop area, placing them onto an empty section of shelf that the owner had pointed out earlier. The task was simple, yet every trip across the store continued to draw their attention toward the displays surrounding them. Near the front counter, several glass jars held brightly colored sweets that looked almost like small pieces of polished stone, each jar filled with hundreds of candies that reflected the light coming through the front windows. Nearby stood trays of wrapped chocolate squares arranged in careful rows, while further along the aisle a wooden rack displayed paper cones filled with mixed candy pieces ready to be purchased by customers. The prisoners worked quietly while moving between the storage room and the shelves, yet the repeated trips allowed them to observe more details about the store and the way it operated. Each section seemed dedicated to a different type of sweet, and the owner carefully directed where every new delivery should be placed so that the displays would remain organized for the customers who visited the shop. While the men arranged the chocolate bars onto the shelves, the bell above the front door rang softly as a young boy entered the store with a few coins in his hand. He walked directly toward the glass jars near the counter while the owner greeted him with a friendly nod. The boy pointed toward one of the jars, and the owner scooped several pieces of candy into a small paper bag before handing it across the counter. The boy smiled, paid for the sweets, and stepped back onto the street within a matter of minutes. For the prisoners, the scene was strangely peaceful. In Europe, even children had grown used to the reality of ration cards and limited supplies. Yet here the boy had simply walked into the store and chosen whatever he wanted from the shelves without hesitation. As the soldiers continued placing the new boxes of chocolate onto the display, the same quiet question returned once again. If this candy shop had been arranged as a display for them, it was being maintained with remarkable attention to detail. Customers came and went as if the store had always looked exactly like this. Nothing about the scene seemed forced or artificial. Even the shelves themselves carried small handwritten price tags beneath each product, suggesting that the sweets had been placed there for sale long before the prisoners arrived that morning. The more the soldiers studied the shop around them, the more uncertain they became about their earlier suspicion. Perhaps the display was not a trick after all. Yet the idea still felt difficult to accept, because after years of war and shortages, the sight of so many sweets gathered in one place continued to feel almost impossible. And that was exactly why several of the men still wondered if there might be another explanation behind what they were seeing. If the war had taught them anything, it was that appearances could sometimes be carefully arranged. And standing inside that small Missouri candy shop, surrounded by jars and boxes filled with sugar and chocolate, the prisoners could not completely ignore the thought that perhaps the abundance around them had been prepared for a reason. As the work continued inside the candy store, the prisoners gradually moved from the storage room back into the main shop area, where the shelves and glass displays were waiting to be filled with the newly delivered sweets. The store owner stood behind the counter while giving instructions through the interpreter, pointing toward empty sections of the display where the next boxes of candy should be placed so that the arrangement would remain neat and easy for customers to see. The soldiers carried the small packages carefully between the narrow aisles, setting the chocolate bars into straight rows while placing additional candy boxes beside the glass jars that already lined the front counters. The displays slowly began to look even fuller than before, with colorful wrappers and bright labels filling the space between the wooden shelves. For men who had spent months surrounded mostly by the simple supplies of a prisoner camp, the environment inside the shop felt unusually lively. The store seemed filled with small objects designed not for survival or military use, but simply for enjoyment. Every shelf carried sweets that had no purpose other than to be eaten for pleasure. As they continued their work, the smell of sugar and chocolate remained strong in the air, and the soldiers occasionally glanced at the displays while moving through the aisles. Some jars held round candies coated in sugar, others contained long strips of licorice twisted into loops, and several wooden trays displayed neatly stacked chocolate bars waiting for customers. The longer the prisoners remained inside the store, the more the atmosphere began to feel less like a staged display and more like a place that operated exactly this way every day. The store owner spoke casually with the guards while arranging items near the counter, occasionally greeting customers who entered through the front door. From time to time, the bell above the entrance rang again as people stepped inside from the street. Some customers walked directly toward the shelves, selecting a few sweets before carrying them to the counter, while others paused to look at the displays before deciding what they wanted to buy. One elderly man entered the shop and removed his hat as he greeted the owner, then slowly examined several jars before choosing a small bag of candy. A young girl followed shortly after, studying the shelves carefully before pointing toward a tray of chocolate squares. The simple routine of these visits created a calm rhythm inside the store that felt far removed from the tension of wartime Europe. Nothing about the customers' behavior suggested that the displays had been arranged for a special purpose. They acted as though the store always looked this way. As the prisoners placed the final packages of chocolate onto the shelves, several of them stepped back for a moment while looking across the shop they had helped organize. The displays stretched from the front windows to the rear wall, filled with sweets of different shapes, sizes, and colors. The scene no longer looked like a temporary arrangement created for visitors. It looked permanent. For the soldiers, this realization slowly began to replace their earlier suspicion with a different thought. Perhaps what they had seen inside the store was not a trick at all. Perhaps the abundance of candy on the shelves was simply normal for this place. Yet, even as that possibility grew stronger, the idea remained difficult for them to accept completely. Because the contrast between the small Missouri candy store and the shortages they remembered from home was still too large to ignore. And standing there surrounded by jars filled with sugar and chocolate, the prisoners could not help feeling that they had just stepped into a world that looked very different from the one they had left behind. By the time the last delivery box had been emptied and the remaining packages of sweets placed neatly onto the shelves, the candy store looked almost exactly as it had when the prisoners first entered earlier that morning, except now the displays were even more organized than before. Rows of chocolate bars filled the wooden shelves while glass jars stood across the front counter, each one packed with colorful candy pieces that reflected the light from the shop windows. The store owner slowly walked along the aisles while examining the displays, occasionally adjusting a jar or straightening a row of candy bars so that the arrangement remained tidy for the customers who would continue visiting the shop throughout the afternoon. Through the interpreter, he explained that the deliveries they had unpacked were part of the regular shipments the store received during the week, supplies that allowed the shop to keep its shelves full for the local community. For the prisoners, this explanation was both interesting and difficult to fully accept. After years of war, they had grown accustomed to the idea that sugar and chocolate were rare luxuries. In Germany, many families had seen sweets disappear from ordinary stores long before the conflict reached its final years, and even when candy did appear, it was usually in small quantities. Yet here in this small Missouri town, the shelves seemed filled with it. While the owner continued inspecting the displays, a few more customers entered through the front door. The bell rang softly as a mother stepped inside with her young son, guiding him toward the shelves while he looked eagerly at the jars of sweets. The boy pointed excitedly toward one of the displays, and the owner scooped a handful of candy into a paper bag before handing it to him across the counter. The boy thanked him and left the shop smiling while holding the small bag tightly in his hand. The simple scene was enough to capture the attention of several prisoners standing nearby. Back home, children had learned not to expect such treats during the war. Sugar had become scarce, and many sweets had disappeared entirely from the stores they remembered. Yet here the boy had walked into the shop and chosen candy as though it were an ordinary part of daily life. As the soldiers observed the quiet routine of the shop for a few more minutes, the earlier suspicion that the store had been arranged as propaganda slowly began to fade. Nothing about the environment suggested that it had been prepared for a special visit. The customers behaved naturally. The owner moved comfortably through the aisles, and the displays looked like they had been arranged long before the prisoners arrived. Eventually, the guards signaled that the work detail had been completed and that it was time for the group to return to the truck waiting outside on the street. The prisoners walked slowly toward the entrance while passing the rows of candy one last time. Even after spending the entire morning inside the shop, the sight of so many sweets gathered in one place still felt unusual. When they stepped outside, the quiet town street looked exactly as it had when they arrived earlier. A few cars passed along the road while people moved between the shops along the sidewalk. The prisoners climbed back into the truck while the guards closed the tailgate behind them, and as the engine started once again, the vehicle slowly began moving away from the storefront. While the candy shop disappeared behind them, several of the soldiers continued thinking about what they had just seen inside. Because for men who had spent years surrounded by the shortages of war, the idea that a small-town store could remain filled with candy still felt almost too strange to believe. The truck rolled slowly out of the small Missouri town and returned to the quiet country road that led back toward the prisoner camp, and the soldiers sat along the wooden sides while the storefronts gradually disappeared behind them, replaced once again by the wide farmland stretching across the countryside. For several minutes, none of the men spoke. Each of them seemed lost in his own thoughts about the unusual morning they had just experienced inside the candy store. The image of the shelves filled with chocolate bars, glass jars of sweets, and trays of candy remained clear in their minds as the truck continued along the road. During the war, many of them had watched food supplies slowly disappear from stores in Germany. Sugar had become scarce, sweets had grown rare, and ration cards had determined what families were allowed to buy. Over time, even the sight of candy had become unusual. That was why the store they had just visited felt so difficult to understand. Inside that small shop, the shelves had been filled with sweets from one end of the room to the other. Customers had entered calmly, choosing candy for their children as if it were an ordinary part of daily life. Nothing about the scene suggested that the display had been arranged for visitors. At first, several of the prisoners had believed the store must have been prepared as propaganda, a carefully arranged example meant to show them how prosperous American life was during the war. But the longer they had worked inside the shop, the harder it had become to believe that explanation. The customers had behaved naturally. The owner had treated the store like any ordinary business. The displays had looked permanent, not temporary. Slowly, the prisoners began to realize that the candy store was probably not a staged display at all. It was simply a normal shop in a small American town. As the truck approached the road leading back to the camp, the familiar fences and watchtowers came into view on the horizon. Soon the soldiers would return to the routine of roll calls, barracks, and long days of waiting behind the wire. Yet the memory of that candy store remained with them. Because for men who had spent years living with the shortages of wartime Europe, the sight of a small shop filled with sweets had revealed something they had not expected to see during captivity. A quiet glimpse of a world that looked very different from the one they had left behind. Thank you for spending this time here. If these quiet, true World War II stories matter to you, subscribing helps this channel continue.